Welcome to Life in Biology, episode number 24. I'm Dr. Joel Graff, and the title of this video is Descent with Modification. This is continuing in my evolution series. It seems like a good place to start an evolution series would be to actually define evolution. And the idea of evolution came around before Darwin, so that's a common misconception. People think evolution, they think Darwin. Darwin didn't come up with the idea that things evolve. Now, the phrase I like best for evolution is descent with modification, and perhaps that is something that Darwin did coin. But people can leave comments below and let me know where descent with modification comes from. At any rate, when Darwin started his manifesto, so to speak, The Origin of Species, he began, at least in my version of this book, he began with an historical sketch, and I'm just going to read a little bit of it. It says, until recently, the great majority of naturalists believed that species were immutable productions and had been separately created. This view has been ably maintained by many authors. Some few naturalists, on the other hand, have believed that species undergo modification and that the existing forms of life are the descendants by true generation of pre-existing forms. And so the idea there that Darwin wants to address head on is, do species change over time? Do breeds of animals, varieties of animals, whatever word you want to use, do they change over time? And he points out that at that time the majority of naturalists believed that animals were immutable. Animals, plants, other living organisms were immutable, meaning they don't change over time. But to get into his book a little bit, one of the first things he has a picture of is a dog, and then he follows that up with, there's another picture, and there's a picture of a rock pigeon. Darwin thought that all pigeons today were evolved from the rock pigeon. So why is he talking about dogs and pigeons? Well, let's talk about dogs first, and this is something I modified from what I found online, so I want to mention Elaine Ostrander and Anatoly Ruvinsky before going any further. But these are dog genetics specialists, and what they're showing here is a timeline. First, they showed that dog skulls were discovered in human settlements around 30,000 years ago. And then a little under 20,000 years ago, there's evidence that dogs were buried with humans. And then between just less than 10,000 years ago, you start to come up with dog breeds that you can distinguish. The first is a sighthound, which I've never even heard of. Then you get some small shaggy dogs, and by about 3,000 years ago, you've got the mastiffs, the toys, and the spitz types of dogs. And from 3,000 years ago to today, we've ramped up to 339 breeds of dogs. And so that is just shows you that once humans get their hands on a species and purposely try to select for different traits, the animals can change rapidly and form varieties rapidly, even though you started with one or a limited number of pigeons or dogs. They expanded into 339 breeds. So that's pretty good evidence that you have animals can change over time based on selective pressures. Then the next thing that Darwin had a picture of was the pigeon, and it has a pretty similar background. It was domesticated perhaps 5,000 years ago, whereas dogs perhaps 30,000 years ago. But just like the dogs, we have over 300 species or breeds, or I'm not really sure on the nomenclature at this point, of pigeons. And just like dogs, the number ramps up as you go over time, and because you have more varieties of pigeons to work with, you can do more crossbreeding between the varieties to come up with expanding numbers of pigeon traits. And so Darwin wanted to start off his book with a talk of selective breeding or domestication of animals or livestock or whatever, because this was something that could happen fast enough that it was documented it was well documented that you could go from a few species to more and more species. So that's why he wanted to talk about dogs and pigeons. There's one more example I want to talk about, and that is cattle. I grew up helping my dad on a cattle ranch, and he has Black Angus, and his chair at home, the floor is covered with egg journals, Angus journals. He's really into cattle genetics, and so I'm throwing this in just for my dad. But I found on beefmagazine.com, it was talking about carcass weights of bulls and cows, steers and heifers, and what you'll see is that whereas here we're talking in terms of thousands of years, here this is 30 years of breeding with an animal that doesn't replicate that quickly. You might give it a heifer a couple of years before you have a cow for you, or have a calf for you. Let me get my terminology straight. But anyway, just over the course of those 20 years, the carcass weights have gone up immensely, and so the changes are anywhere from around 150 to 220 pounds increase in carcass weight over just a 30-year span. And you should know that not all cattle genetics breedings are just to make bigger cows. There's other traits that people are looking for as well. And this is the carcass weight, and so the total body weight of cattle have probably gone up by twice these numbers of pounds. And so it just is a really excellent example of how quickly animals can change, organisms can change, when you selectively breed and select for traits and whatnot. And so the problem that Darwin ran into with his discussion of evolution is the idea of how much time does it take. So he pointed out selective breeding, which goes quickly, but in natural selection, which is what he is credited for coming up with, the time scales are much longer, and we'll talk about the controversy there with length of time. But I just want to bring those up as a way to say that evolution is organisms changing over time, or the title of this video is Descent with Modification. And so it's very obvious that things change over time. So right off the bat, I think we can all agree that things evolve. What we're going to do next video is we're going to be starting to talk about mechanisms, because mechanisms of how things change over time. In science, you have two different things. You can make observations and you can determine the mechanism. Observations are like what we just agreed on, and that is that animals can change over time. Mechanisms are understanding how the animals change over time, or the organisms change over time. And we're going to talk about a few ideas that were floated around even before Darwin wrote his book. So I hope you stay tuned, and that's coming up next.